There's something happening within our national forests and parks, not just across the country, but across the entire world. Today's episode will take us all across the various national parks and the multitude of eyewitnesses who've experienced bizarre things they simply can't explain. You won't want to miss this one. David, growing up near Hot Springs National Park, well, he was simply no stranger to hearing odd tales from his friends and other people who had hiked around there about strange things lurking in the wooded areas. But of course, being a man of rational thinking and thought, never really tried to put much stock into these kinds of stories until he had a bizarre encounter of his own. You see, for David, it happened just a few years back when he was actually hiking the Sunset Trail with a couple of his close friends. Now, at this time, they were roughly about 2 miles in the trail when David had spotted some odd movement up ahead. Now, at first, like anybody else, you would think it was a deer, but as he began creeping his way closer and looking, he realized that whatever he was seeing was actually not a deer because it was standing upright on 2 legs. And he could literally feel the breath catch in his throat when it then turned to face him, and he realized in that moment that it was definitely not a deer or a bear or any animal that he had ever seen before. And in fact, he noted that its eyes almost seemed to glow this amberish red color, and before he could take another step, it let out this ungodly scream before darting back off into the brush with what he would describe as a superhuman speed. Now, of course, like anybody else, him and his friends were now freaking out, going on about how they don't know what it could have been. Maybe it was a Bigfoot or something supernatural, but he tried his best to keep his cool head, and he actually pulled out his phone to see if he could take any pictures of the evidence that it left behind. But from what David had claimed, there really was nothing left behind. No tracks, no footprints, just nothing. And so that's when he was trying to convince himself, and his friends were all talking, that clearly this had to have been someone in a costume trying to play a trick on them. But deep down, he knew that what he saw just couldn't have matched up. The way it screamed and the grace and fluidity of its movements as it darted off, it just wasn't possible for someone to maintain in a suit. And he went on to describe that after they got the heck out of Dodge, over the next few weeks, that image of this thing was just burned forever in his head. And in fact, he managed to go back down that trail one more time to try and attempt to document evidence of whatever this was. So one weekend, he actually set out all by himself, simply armed with his camera on his cell phone. And he actually retraced his exact steps along the Sunset Trail to the very spot where him and his friends had seen whatever this thing was. Now, one thing he noted was that the woods seemed very quiet that day, far more quiet than usual. And so he just tried his best to shake off his nerves, and he started examining the area thoroughly. And he noted that about 50 or so yards off the trail, he began noticing this strange odor. And the further and further he got, the smell grew stronger and far more foul. And in fact, in a small clearing, he would stumble upon the half-eaten carcass of a deer. Now, of course, there could be many reasons for this half-eaten carcass, but it was something that struck him as odd, is that the deer or the elk, from the looks of it, had not been eaten on, but literally torn in half from the stomach down. Something with immense strength had torn it and then just left it. Now, it's obvious that no wolf or bear could have done that kind of damage, and all of us watching know that coyotes, wolves, and bear don't kill an animal that way. And so as he's checking out this carcass, he suddenly feels these dagger eyes on him, and so he spins around and he hears the same horrific blood-curdling scream echoing throughout the woods around him. And now his heart is pounding. He thinks he's about to die, so he turns to run but freezes at something standing right behind him. and there was the exact same being that he described that he saw a few weeks earlier, only it was standing in daylight, and he described it being at least 8 feet tall, covered in this matted, nasty, unkempt looking hair, and he described it having these long dagger-like claws that were very curved, and he could even describe how it had hot breath steaming from its mouth, but that this thing was actually crouched down, ready to pounce at a moment's notice. And in that moment, he knew that whatever this thing was no person in a costume. This was something primal and evil. And it let out another bone-chilling wail, and suddenly his legs remembered how to move, he described, and so, like never before, crashing through brush and leaping over rocks and logs, this thing pursued him, but it's almost like it purposely kept its distance from him, almost as if chasing him out of its territory, because he described with the muscle mass and speed and power of this thing that he witnessed not only this time but last time, it could have caught up to him if it really wanted to, but it didn't. Now, at some point during this chase, he described feeling a searing pain as this thing's claws actually raked at his shoulder, and so he's fighting panic, and he remembered that a narrow ravine was up ahead, but it was too steep for it to follow, so he pushes harder and harder despite his muscles. Scrambling into the ravine, he squeezed into a small cave opening about halfway down, and his chest is heaving. And this thing appeared above, sticking its snout into the gap, snapping its jaws only inches away from his face, but the opening was too slim. And so with this enraged, deafening roar that rang in his ears, he described that after about 30 or so seconds, it gave up and disappeared. And so now he's completely terrified. He's huddled in this tiny cave for hours, shaking uncontrollably, terrified, unsure of what is about to come. And then when he finally emerged, he described how dusk was falling, and he somehow found the strength to stagger his way back to the trailhead. It was there that he collapsed by his truck, bleeding, clothes torn, and to his relief, his friends were there, shocked at the sight of him. Knowing that he couldn't just simply go around and tell people that he had been attacked by some sort of monster, he just described how he had had a nasty fall and a couple of branches had whacked him. One of the things that really stuck out to David during this experience is how he would go on about those amberish red eyes and how it had this putrid smell and how it was emanating evil. Now, David didn't really go on to describe whether it was canine looking or whether it was human looking. In fact, he never described it having a snout. In fact, he actually described it looking more man-like, that it was kind of more boulder-shaped and big and broad, but also very fast and lean. Something that David thought about was that whatever it was is perhaps some sort of primordial missing link, but maybe it was never meant to be unearthed, but that there's something living in the confines of the Hot Springs National Park that he had encountered that maybe he wasn't supposed to. Either way, it's something that he will never forget, and he promises to never step foot in or around that area ever again, and is very thankful to be alive. In the deep recesses of the woods, a man sat by the campfire, warming his freezing hands against the cold weather. The crackling fire was his only company, warding off loneliness. And suddenly, he hears a piercing scream, but not from the surrounding woods, but from the sky. Now, frantically, he looks around and he sees this bright light descending right above him. Now, completely panic-stricken and uncertain of what was happening, this blue beam, as he described it, extends towards him. Quickly standing up, he pulls out his extra carbon fiber card holder and held it up between himself and the blue beam. And the beam suddenly stopped. Thanks to the card holder's 3K space-grade carbon fiber and expandable aluminum backplate with RFID blocking technology, he narrowly escaped the clutches of the unknown entity attempting to abduct him and also ensuring his personal data was safe even in the most remote locations. As the man stood in the clearing, his heart pounding, he couldn't even help but marvel at the effectiveness of his extra carbon fiber card holder bound in leather. I mean, just moments ago, he'd been on the verge of some sort of supernatural encounter, but this slim, high-tech accessory had somehow deflected the strange beam. In fact, he actually would remember why he chose Exeter in the first place. I mean, not only for their innovative approach to everyday carry essentials, but also for their commitment to sustainability. And so, breathing a sigh of relief, he pocketed the card holder, its sleek design allowing for it to slip easily into its pocket despite carrying over 12 cards and cash. Like this. Pretty cool. It was remarkably slim, yet it held everything he needed. You see, it was actually nestled within his Parliament wallet, made from environmentally certified premium leather, its extra pocket perfect for his outdoor adventures. But folks, what truly set Exeter apart was their innovative tracker card. This guy. Now, as he gazed out at the stars, he thought about how the solar-powered tracking device required just 2 hours of sunlight for a 3-month charge. That's crazy. This was a marvel of modern technology. The tracker could ring his wallet and phone, making it impossible to lose them even in the vast wilderness. Plus, with the voice activation compatible with Siri, Alexa, and Google, it was like having a personal assistant right in his pocket. And if he was, ever abducted by Men in Black, well, we'd simply be able to track him with the app that comes with the wallet. Now, as the night deepened, the man began reflecting on the perfect Christmas gift for his outdoor friends, Exeter. And with the current sale, he knew he could actually afford to share these incredible wallet and accessories with his friends and family, because Exeter is offering up to a 50% discount on their website starting December 4th. And with the special code down below, all listeners to this story could get an additional 5% off, amounting to a total of a 55% discount. The man smiled, the earlier scare forgotten, and this Christmas, he would be giving the gift of security, style, and sustainability. Thanks, Exeter. Our next story involves a man by the name of Ed who had gone on the Big Bend National Park. And so this time he was on a weekend camping trip with his cousin. They had begun to set up their tents at the Chisos Basin campground and were preparing dinner when the sun started to descend and go down. The fading evening light would cast this strange glow over the surrounding mountains that almost told Bob that something abnormal is about to happen. In fact, even he felt a bit unsettled, but of course just assumed that maybe it was because he was in a very remote area as darkness was beginning to fall. And so as Bob and Ed ate around their campfire, Ed suddenly caught movement out of the corner of his eye, and so he looks towards a group of very large oak trees, roughly about 50 or so yards from their site, and he froze in complete shock. Perched atop one of the thicker branches was a humanoid figure, but it looked like none that they had ever seen before. And in fact, in the flickering of the firelight, he could make out this almost grotesque leathery skin, kind of like that of a bat. And it had a very flattened face with a sunken-in black eyes and rows of sharp teeth looking very visible even from a distance. And so what startled him the most were these huge dark wings that could clearly be seen behind its back. I mean, it looked exactly like a legendary gargoyle that had come to life. And so Ed's going, "Bob! Bob!" whispering harshly, not taking his eyes away from this thing. "There's something over in there in that tree watching us. Tell me you could see it too." And so Bob's like, "What?" And so he follows Ed's gaze and he hears him suck in a sharp breath. They both now clearly see it, and they're sitting there paralyzed for a moment, just staring at this impossible creature only mere feet away. And suddenly it unfurls its massive wings and just takes off into the night sky. Within seconds, it was lost from view in the darkness. But the real question is, why was it sitting there watching them? And so both Bob and his cousin just sat there in a shocked silence for a while, trying to process what it was they had actually witnessed. I mean, neither of them had any sort of reasonable explanation for this figure that seemed to match all mythical descriptions of an actual gargoyle in incredible detail. Well, they cut their camping trip short and they left the park the next morning, still very shaken up by their bizarre encounter. Now, of course, afterwards, they would do their best and scour all sorts of cryptozoology websites, since it was the closest thing they could possibly find, and they actually stumbled upon something that was known as a flying humanoid, or more commonly known as winged humanoid sightings. And in fact, a lot of these have been reported in places like Chicago and the East Coast, believe it or not. Now, of course, he never would have imagined that something this terrifying would have exposed itself to him, and of course, in all places in the Texas desert. Even though that happened roughly 12 or 13 years ago, Bob and his cousin still talk about that night years after, constantly affirming to each other that yes, they both saw the same thing matching the same descriptions that was completely unnatural despite their environment and what they were around. Among those very trees at their campsite in Big Bend National Park, my question to all of you is, what they saw real, or did they just have an hallucination? I'm curious to know your answers. Our next story takes us far to the north, as a man named Colton experienced something he couldn't explain while on a 4-day backpacking trip in the Glacier National Park. After making his way deep into the rugged backcountry, he'd been planning this solo adventure for months and could hardly contain his excitement as the wilderness continued to envelop him and get thicker and denser and far more wild. And in fact, Colton would report that the first day was fantastic. There was nothing wrong. He set off at a steady pace, stopping frequently to photograph these stunning vistas of sharp mountain peaks and jewel-toned lakes. And as evening fell, he would make a camp alongside a creek, the babble of the water lulling him to sleep inside his little one-person tent. It was as peaceful and serene as it could possibly get. In fact, he describes that he couldn't have even asked for a better day. Now, the second day was also clear and sunny, and Colton would be seen continuing his journey, kind of scrambling his way up the switchbacks that were carved into the mountainsides, but also keeping one eye on the trail and the other on the lookout for additional wildlife. Now, as he climbed higher and higher, the air began growing noticeably cooler and the trees sparser. Now, by late afternoon, he had actually reached the alpine tundra, desolate save for patches of hardy wildflowers and lichen. And so Colton located a place to make camp, nestled right between two large boulders that blocked the worst of the wind. And so he began setting up camp and getting all ready to go. And so after dinner, he bundled up, headed out to watch the sunset, and scrambled up to a small bluff to take in the beautiful 360-degree views. And of course, the sky would shift in colors to that dusky lavender. You know what we're talking about, right? As the sun began to dip below the ragged horizon, and it was gorgeous. Now, as darkness began to descend, Colton would then gaze upon the dazzling display of stars that were all across the night sky, and he described feeling but complete and utter calmness and peace. And so after a while, he decided he was getting pretty chilly, and he went back down to his camp, got in his sleeping bag, and fell asleep. Now later, he was jolted from his sleep by this, what he would describe as a bone-chilling shriek, and it seemed to echo all around him. The sound was like nothing he had ever heard before. It was high-pitched and warbling, almost like a woman screaming, but with a very strange and unusual vibrato. So Colton sat bolt upright inside his tent, his pulse raising, struggling to steady his shaking hands as he began fumbling for his headlamp, and he swept the harsh LED beam all around, but the pooling darkness revealed nothing. The night was so still, save for his own breaths, and eventually, Colton convinced himself it must have been a cougar or a coyote possibly making the horrible noise, but still, sleep did not return easily. Colton was very familiar with the outdoors and the animals within them, and this scream was very unusual. And so the next morning came, and the sky was all gloomy with gray and overcast, and he broke camp early and pressed on, unnerved by the complete and absolute solitude surrounding him. And at this point, the terrain now grew steeper, and he would struggle up scree fields, lungs burning in the thin alpine air, and by the early afternoon, a bone-chilling drizzle had begun to fall. And so Colton stopped up to layer up more, knowing that hypothermia posed a serious risk. And he would continue slogging uphill, rain collecting in his eyelashes and the fog obscuring any clear path forward. And all of a sudden, this intensely foul, sulfurous odor would just wash over him, seeming to emanate from the very fog itself. Now, Colton began gagging, and he pulled his shirt up over his nose like this as his eyes began burning and watering. Blinking through the tears, he realized with horror that he could now make out this dark human figure that would emerge from the mist only mere feet in front of him. And what he described was like something out of a nightmare. Twisted horns curling back from its elongated skull, and its skin resembled burnt human flesh. And he would describe these yellow eyes with slitted pupils boring into him, devoid of any warmth or emotion. And at that point, time seemed to completely come to a stop, fear gripping every fiber of his being. His feet were now rooted helplessly in place as he just could do nothing but stare into this grotesque face. Now, he remembers a scream catching in his throat as this thing's lipless mouth gaped open, revealing rows of what he would describe as pointed fangs. It would step forward, a clawed hand actually outstretched as this growl would issue from its deep chest, and sheer desperation and terror would now flood Colton's body with adrenaline, and without thinking, all his body could do was just react, and so he turns on his heels and begins hurtling back down this very slippery slope, mind you. He's risking a lot of injuries by doing this. His pace was very reckless, and if he moved wrong, he could really face serious injury. But still, this thing pursued him. Frigid tendrils of fog began to lick at his back as he ran, and after what felt like an eternity, Colton dared a glance behind him. Now, as he did, there was nothing but mist, but still he raced on, not stopping until he came across a family of hikers that were several miles down the trail. At this point, he's so overcome with fear and his emotions, he just begins babbling incoherently about what had chased him and nearly collapsed with exhaustion and relief. That was Colton's last backpacking trip, and he still has severe nightmares about whatever this nightmare from the fog was, though no one else seemed to believe his tale, not even his closest friends and family. But Colton swears by what he saw and describes that this was a physical being, not something that was from a dream or something in corporeal form. It was very real, and that he feels lucky to escape that mountain alive. Our fourth story takes us into the heart of Yosemite National Park back in the summer of 2023 this year. A man by the name of Mateo was the victim of this unfortunate story. Now, Mateo was like a lot of us who watch this channel. He had always loved hiking and camping, and Yosemite was one of his favorite places, and described how it was just the environment and the park's geography that just drew him in. I mean, you got the beautiful granite cliffs and the giant sequoia trees. How could you not love the scenery? And so he heads out on the trail mid-morning. He never exactly explained which trail, and he was planning to hike about 8 miles to a backcountry campsite that he had actually reserved for the next 2 nights. And so the first few miles went very smooth, and as he's taking all the beauty in around him, the wildflowers blooming, a meadow filled with butterflies, a stream tumbling over smooth boulders, well, after maybe about 4 or 5 miles, he came around a bend and was very surprised to see a large animal right in the middle of the trail about 30 yards ahead. Now, at first glance, he assumed it was a large black bear, but as he looked more closely, he began to realize that the size didn't match up and that maybe it was a grizzly bear. But grizzly bears aren't anywhere near Yosemite. So now all these things were running through his head like, what is he looking at? And this is all happening within seconds, mind you. And he could see that this animal was hunched down eating something, and it actually had the appearance like a hyena. And he would describe it having a ridge along its back and markings on its leg. And this creature was massive, probably 6 feet tall at the shoulder and maybe 8 feet long or more. Just a huge creature. And he described it actually being about the size of a horse or a small cow. And as you can imagine, the sheer sight of this alone would make anybody stunned. But the animal seemed intent on its meal and had not even paid him any attention. And so his mind began racing over what he should do. Now, normally, he would try and scare off a bear by yelling and waving his arms around, but he had no idea if that would even work on whatever this bizarre creature was. And so, after a few long seconds, this animal had raised its head and turned to look straight at him. And that's for the first time when he saw these large black eyes meet his, and his breath literally caught in his throat. What he was looking at was completely unknown for him. This thing made a low rumbling sound from its throat that seemed almost like a growl, but different. He described it almost like it was trying to speak to him. Now, immediately the hair would stand up on his back and his neck, and a feeling of hot blood and terror would rush through him, and he knew he needed to get away from this very potentially dangerous predator. And so he just begins backing up slowly the way he had come, keeping his eyes locked on this animal, and it continued staring back at him and made no move to attack, but also did not run. And once he got maybe 50 yards away, he felt safe enough then to turn his back and run as fast as he could down the trail, and ran for at least 2 miles, only occasionally looking behind him to make sure he was not being chased. And once he got back to his car, still in complete shock, he had hiked extensively all over the West and thought he knew about every animal native to these forests. But as he had no explanation for what he had just witnessed, the creature seemed like something out of mythology, he would describe, a legendary creature that should not exist. But yet there it was, living and breathing in an ordinary national park trail. In fact, he still gets chills remembering that piercing black gaze boring into his eyes. And he reported the sighting to a park ranger apparently when he got home, but they told him that there was no unusual animals living in the area matching his description. So really, he doesn't know, and the identity and the origins of that creature remain a complete mystery. The following story is by an eyewitness who had never named themselves, other than throwing around the word Jay. So that's what we're going to call him. So Jay was hiking along the shore of a remote lake deep in Yosemite National Park when he had claimed that he had spotted movement in the water. Now, as he watched, he would describe this massive hairy arm reaching out of the lake, and thick fur matted and dripping, and this clawed hand grasped this rocky shore seeking purchase. And then a second arm appeared, equally as large and powerful, and is now as hard as racing as this thing begins pulling its enormous body from the depths of the lake. Now, of course, he's completely frozen in fear as this thing rises before him, and it's well over 8 feet tall. Its torso was thick and muscular, covered in the same wet, tangled fur. The creature then turned, facing him with an ape-like visage. Beady little eyes regarded him as it bared long fangs and a snarl. In fact, he actually likened it to more that of a baboon face with black reddish eyes and very sharp fangs. And so he began stumbling backward as the monstrous thing lumbered onto shore, briefly standing on 2 legs before dropping to all 4s. Now, what's really interesting to me is that he actually described this creature looking almost identical to the character in the video game Primal Rage, which was a very popular 1990s fighting video game. And in fact, there's a character by the name of Chaos, and that is actually the picture that he described it looking like, minus the large hairdo. But he described the face being almost identical, but that it was more baboon-like in appearance and looked more fierce and frightening. Now, apparently this thing would stare at him only a moment longer and then would turn and shamble into the woods and would disappear entirely. Now, he described its demeanor was more annoyed and frustrated that he was there, as if his presence alone was now prohibiting it from doing something, whatever it was supposed to do, but he described it being annoyed like he wasn't supposed to see it there. Interesting. And so, of course, he would hurry back to his camp completely shaken, but would later research sightings that were similar to what he had experienced. And so he's now convinced that he had actually seen a Bigfoot creature emerging from that very remote lake. And now he still does venture into the backcountry. He does give those lonely waters a wide berth from now on. And of course, the memory of that day alone will forever stick with him. But As far as what he saw, we don't know, and neither does he. But he believes that it still lurks within and around the area. Our next story is about a man named Roy. And Roy, like many of the other people in this video, have always enjoyed hiking and camping, specifically in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And Roy has been coming to and around this area ever since he was a kid, so he has a lot of experience just being out in the woods and camping and doing Boy Scouts and just being involved in all things outdoors. But something would now forever put a damper on his love for the outdoors, an experience that would change everything for him over the course of a weekend. So it all began when he and his buddies had decided to do an overnight backpacking trip in the northwestern area of the park, specifically right near Tuckaleechee Cove. And so they would hike up to a clearing on a ridge that offered amazing views stretching all the way to the Tennessee River Valley. Now, after setting up camp, they stayed until sunset, just snapping photos of deer and wild turkeys wandering through the cove below. And around 9 p.m. they turned in, exhausted from the long uphill trek that they experienced that day. Now, he woke up only a few hours later to this strange noise, this chilling, raspy scream echoing from the trees behind their tents. Now, at first, his mind is trying to rationalize what he's hearing, and he realizes that it must be a bobcat or a panther cry, but he's like, no, that can't be right. This is more of a guttural, just a deeper kind of croaking roar to it. And so he quickly shone his flashlight towards the tree line, but couldn't see anything. Now, so he's like, you know what, forget it. I'm just going to go back to bed. So he lies back down, falls asleep. Now, him and his friend get up the following morning. And what's interesting is he mentioned it to his friends that they actually slept through the whole thing, that they hadn't woken up. So he's like, well, maybe it was just me. Well, anyway, so on the hike back, they took a completely different trail, a less used path that actually descended very steeply to the valley floor. And he was in front when he had heard loud cracking branches and undergrowth up ahead. Now he's starting to get pretty alert because he's like, oh my gosh, there's a bear. And he froze mid-thought as what he would describe as a tall, skinny creature with an elongated dog-like head emerged out onto the trail roughly 30 feet in front of him. He would describe it as standing on two legs and had very dark fur with strange horn-like protrusions extending from its head. Now, the thing immediately stopped and looked over at him and would lock eyes briefly before just vanishing off into the brush, disappearing entirely. Now, of course, once his friends caught up with them, they just laughed at him and said that he was feeling nutty and that he probably had some sort of hallucination, maybe he should drink more water, but he was adamant about what he saw, that he's very familiar with the flora and fauna and the deer and the other creatures in the area. This didn't match anything ordinary. And even now, he still gets chills as he types out his story, and just remembering those cold, dead, staring eyes, he's not even sure if he'll ever venture into that part of the Smokies again, at least not alone. And went on to mention that his entire worldview has now been forever altered after coming face to face with something that isn't supposed to exist, a being that he can only describe as some kind of horned werewolf. As a matter of fact, it's pretty funny because he would describe that he used to be the kind of guy that would actually make fun of people for talking about ghosts and the supernatural and Bigfoot encounters, and that those people were just out of their darn minds. But after having his own experience, he now has the utmost respect for others who are able to step forward and share their own personal experiences. What do you guys think of his experience? Our next story takes us deep into the Shenandoah National Park, where a man by the name of Tristan had decided to go on a solo backpacking trip. And so at this time, he would pack all of his gear, drive down to Skyline Drive, stopping at the Matthews Arm Campground to start his trek. And so he began hiking along the Appalachian Trail, taking in all the lush greenery and humming insects, and eventually came upon the remains of an old barn right near Elk Wallow Gap. Now, of course, seeking shelter from the midday heat, he would duck inside, and while resting on a bale of rotting hay, he suddenly heard a strange rustling noise. And so he slowly turns his head, expecting to see a snake or a rodent, but instead he saw a tiny humanoid figure no more than 6 inches tall rummaging through a pile of debris in the corner. And he would describe it as wearing an outfit of woven grass and leaves, and he watched in complete shocked silence as it sorted through bits of wood and rock as if searching for something. Now, after a few moments, this little thing must have sensed his presence because they were both in silence, and it abruptly stopped its work, turned to face him, and they just stared at one another for a very tense moment. And with surprising speed, it then scurried across the barn floor, squeezing into a hole in the stone wall, vanishing from view. Now, of course, he leapt up to examine the spot, but found no trace of the odd, tiny person. Now, he would actually go on to tell some of the park rangers about his experience when he would later return from his hike. And they had informed him that similar sightings are just simply part of local folklore and that those things don't exist. Well, according to legend of a hidden community, there are tiny humans no taller than a person's hand, and they apparently have lived secretly all throughout the mountains from the Appalachians to the Great Smokies in our country's national forest for centuries. Now, he's not exactly sure what he saw or if these were mythical creatures, but he's certainly going to be looking more closely at and around his surroundings on his next Shenandoah backpacking adventure. Story 8 takes us deep into the heart of Zion National Park, specifically summer of 2021, where a man named Alan decided to take a road trip out west. And so he would take a few of his friends that he had back from college, and also one of their mutual friends who was visiting from out of state. They would go, they'd rent an SUV, and they made the drive down, stopping at parks all along the way. Now, Stan was really into hiking and camping, and so he planned out this massive 2-week trip for them with stops at Crater Lake, Yosemite, Death Valley, Bryce Canyon, and finishing off at Zion National Park. And that first night there, they were all pretty exhausted from the long drive that day, so they turned in early after having some beers all around the campfire. Now, the very next morning, they get up early to hit the trails, and one of his buddies had this intense hike planned up to Observation Point. And so they begin the hike right around 8 in the morning just to try and avoid the worst heat of the day. Now, the views were just unbelievable, looking down into the canyon and all the rock formations surrounding them. They would take a break at one overlook, and they began noticing a park ranger truck driving on a service road down below them. And so one of the friends pulls out his binoculars to check it out, and that's when he spots something through the binoculars that made his jaw drop. And he tells them all, shh, 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 be very quiet and still. And now he's visibly shaking as he's described what he's seeing through the binoculars. There was a very tall, skinny creature covered in thick brown fur walking along the same service road as the park ranger truck. Now, he described it looked almost like an impossibly tall wolf walking on 2 legs, and as he described it, suddenly they hear this scream echoing through the canyon that made their blood run cold, and so immediately he pans his binoculars to his friends, trying to find the creature again, but it seemed to have vanished. Now, they all sat there completely stunned, not sure what to make of what they had just heard, and so one of the friends suggested it was likely just a wolf or a really big coyote calling out. But the way this sound reverberated, it sounded like no animal that any of them had ever heard before, and coupled with what the friend had just seen through the binoculars, the minds of all of them were racing with possibilities. And so they continued on their hike up to Observation Point, but were still very much on edge, and they stuck very close together, more so than ever before. None of them couldn't help but be looking over their shoulder now and then. And they finally made it to the top and took in the views, though still a bit unsettled by their earlier experience. And as the sun began to move lower and lower and lower, they built up the fire, staying close by it, nervously scanning the darkness as night set in around them. They all turned in early that night, shaken by the day's events, and of course he tossed and turned in his tent, struggling to sleep, and sometime in the early morning hours, he woke to the sound of heavy footsteps and deep breathing right outside his tent. He sat bolt upright, too terrified to even peek out, but Alan knew something was out there. The footsteps began circling the campsite, and as the breathing got louder and closer before eventually fading into the distance. Well, somehow they managed to fall asleep, and when morning came, they immediately broke down camp, not wanting to stay another night at all. And as they drove out of the park, they talked through what they each experienced and tried to make sense of it. Alan's friend, the one with the binoculars, remained convinced he saw some kind of wolf-like creature on 2 legs. That, combined with the bone-chilling howl and all the strange noises around the tent that night, left them believing that something otherworldly lives and exists in Zion National Park. And in fact, to this day, they have not been able to shake that feeling and that sound that was echoing through the canyon, nor have neither of them ever returned. Story 9 takes us to a man named Forrest who decided to take a camping trip in Mount Rainier National Park just to try and get away from the stress of his life and his job and just the busyness of city life. And so he packed up his old pickup truck and headed out one early Saturday morning. Now, he talks about the drive there was just so peaceful, and he would take in all the beautiful mountain scenery. And as he arrived at the park in the early afternoon, he began to set up his tent at the designated campground right near some popular hiking trails. Now, after getting settled in, he himself went for a hike as the sun began to go down. Now, he was enjoying the crisp, clean air and the sound of birds chirping when suddenly everything just kind of fell quiet. And now there was nothing, no insects, no birds. It was eerily quiet. In fact, even he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. And he felt like he was being watched from the woods, by the very dense woods, mind you, surrounding him. And he tried to shake the feeling off as he continued down the trail, but the sun just kept dipping lower and lower, and he described starting to feel very unsafe, that he was in danger. And he would describe next noticing large footprints on the trail that didn't look quite human. And so now he starts to panic as he realizes that he needs to get out of there and get back to camp. And just as he finishes that thought, he hears a loud twig snap and this loud guttural grunt, like a come from the bushes nearby. And so he freezes in his tracks, and now he's thinking that he's either about to get mugged, beaten, murdered, or all three. At this point, the blood is completely drained from his face, and he starts hearing these crashing sounds in the bush heading right towards him. And before he could even react to this, he describes this tall, hairy, ape-looking creature emerging onto the trail, blocking his only exit, and described it being at least 7 to 8 feet tall, covered in this reddish hair with a very flat face and intense glowing eyes that he would describe that pierce through him. And so he just describes standing there, face to face, sizing each other up for what felt like an eternity, his mind going blank, and his legs went weak, and he urinated himself. And he would just stare into these eyes, and he described this thing snarling, baring its teeth, which he described were all razor sharp, which jolted him back to his senses. And he realized now that his fight or flight was kicking in. It was either do or die. And without thinking, he bolted off the trail, not on the trail, but he bolted off the trail into the dense forest, having no idea where he was even going. He was just reacting to the situation. And so he's weaving in between trees and jumping over rocks and fallen logs. He could hear these thunderous footsteps, boom, 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 coming up behind him, getting closer, and he pushes himself harder, running like his life is dependent on it. And finally, he clears the tree line and sees his pickup truck. He was almost there. He sprints across the open field to his truck, his lungs about to burst. He didn't dare look back. And so he reaches for the driver's side door, fumbling for his keys. His hands are shaking uncontrollably. And as he scrambled to unlock the door, he hears this thing closing in, snarling. And just as it burst from the tree line, he swings the door open, dives inside, and slams it shut. So this thing actually goes up to the side of his truck and takes its fist like this and actually pounds the side of his truck angrily as he's shakily tried to get the key into the ignition, and it actually presses its face up against the glass, peering through him through the window with what he described as a wild, hateful, rage-filled eyes. And he just kept shouting in desperation, pleading for the engine to start, and on the third try, it roars to life. He slams on the gas pedal, spewing dirt and pebbles behind him, and he speeds off down the access road. And he describes driving all through the night until he reached back home. He cleaned the numerous cuts covering his arms and legs, and then would completely collapse exhausted onto his bed just as the sun was rising. Now, what's really interesting about his experience is that, like some of the others, he would describe that it let him go. That if it really wanted to rip him out of the car and kill him and eat him or whatever it had plans to do, it would have. But it seemed like its entire demeanor and mission that evening was to just terrify him as much as it possibly could. Because after he got in the truck and it pressed its face up against the window, with its power, it could have easily broken the window and reached in and grabbed him, but it didn't. It's almost like it gave him this look that, don't you ever come back or I'll have you, and you won't be lucky next time. He would even describe going completely numb for about 3 or 4 days afterwards, just trying to process the horrific nightmare he had endured, and never actually ended up going back for all of his really nice camping supplies that he would just have completely abandoned there and was far too scared to ever go back. Now, this was very, very traumatizing for him, but fortunately for him, he was able to regain his strength, and within the next year's time, actually had decided to take another camping trip, this time bringing his wife and 2 young daughters ages 3 and 5 as they drove into Mount Rainier National Park. And of course, he's having to deal with the trauma of the memories that had washed over him, but he's thinking that now, maybe since he has his family with him, it'll be safer, it'll be better. He's not sure, but he's willing to give it a try. And so he's doing his best to shake it off. Keep in mind, he's never told his wife or family about this, and he doesn't want to alarm them. So they get to their camp spot, they begin setting up their camp, and things are actually going pretty good. There's no sense of the woods going quiet, nothing weird, nothing out of the ordinary happening. It seems like he's actually going to catch a break for the first time in quite a while. And in fact, things go great that first night. Everything is normal. Now, that following morning, his wife would take their toddler to the park restroom while he would stay back at the park with his 5-year-old. Now, of course, being 5, she grew bored and begged to go play hide and seek in the woods nearby with him. And he's still kind of a little choked up about what had happened last time, but hesitantly he agreed, not wanting her to wander off alone. And so, as he's scanning the trees searching for her, panic begins to set in, because he spots movement and sees her come running at full speed out of the brush. She crashes into him, shaking and crying hysterically, and of course he can only imagine the worst. And so when he finally is able to calm her down, she describes to her, "Daddy, there's a praying mantis." And he's thinking, what? Well, apparently she was trying to describe to him that she had seen a giant praying mantis being even taller than her dad. And she said that it just stared at her until she found the courage to run, and immediately he could just feel the color draining from his face. Flashbacks of his last trip began flooding his memory, and so he's looking all over her body for any signs of harm, but didn't find any. And she said, "Dad, I'm fine, nothing happened, but I'm scared to even go back. I want to go home." And in fact, she would tell him that she had this strange pain and discomfort all over her body. And in fact, that evening, which for whatever reason they decided to stick around, because when the wife came back with the toddler, he didn't want to tell her, and he told his 5-year-old daughter, "Listen, don't say anything to your mother. I don't want to spook them. Let's just try and have a good camping trip." Well, later that night, she would have these horrific nightmares, and after the second day, it was then he decided they must leave this park immediately. Now, for whatever reason, over the following next few months, she began having these horrific reoccurring nightmares about threatening beings trying to abduct her, like she had been marked somehow. And then he himself began having these horrific visions and premonitions of his family dying in the future at some undisclosed point. Now, this was a man who was always very mentally clear, very focused, never had any history of mental illness or hallucinations, and was now having these almost weekly, and all he could do was pinpoint it back to whatever it is he experienced in Mount Rainier National Park. He firmly believes that whatever entities he encountered or came into contact with had marked him and did something to him in some way that is now allowing him to, I don't want to say channel this, but to experience what he's experiencing, and he describes them as horrific and doesn't wish them upon his worst enemy. Story 10 takes us into the life of Melissa, who is a 34-year-old woman who had recently moved to Maine with her husband and 2 young daughters. Now, they had bought a little house near Arcadia National Park because they wanted to be closer to nature. Now, apparently, one weekend on a sunny Saturday morning, her girls begged her to take them on a hike so they could look for frogs and butterflies. And so she agreed, and they had set out on one of these shorter trails in the park. Well, after about a mile or so, the dense forest would open up into this sunny meadow, and her daughters ran ahead giggling as they chased the grasshoppers. And so Melissa took a minute to appreciate the scenic view when she noticed something very odd in her peripheral vision. Now, about 50 or so feet away stood an incredibly tall mantis-like creature, she described, and then it had to be at least 8 feet tall with long, spindly arms and huge bulbous eyes that seemed to be staring right at her. Now, as you could imagine, as anybody would be, she was frozen in complete fear and disbelief. This creature looked exactly like a praying mantis, but it was the size of a full-grown man, and noted that it had some sort of alien golden device wrapped around its chest, but she couldn't really describe what it looked like, but just that she would see the reflection of the gold on it. And they would lock eyes for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds before, in an instant, she would describe it cloaking in front of her. Kind of like the movie The Predator, where you can kind of see the outline of it, but it was invisible, and she could see how it kind of just drifted off and almost just faded away into obscurity and was gone. Now, she was so hysterical and badly shaken over this, she grabs her 2 daughters, who thank God didn't see it, rushing back to the car, constantly looking over her shoulder to make sure they were not being followed. And as you can imagine, since that day, she too has had these horrific nightmares about those huge eyes and just this entity itself, and she does not let her girls anywhere out of her sight, and she's hardly told anybody about what she saw because it's such a strange, bizarre experience, and she doesn't think she'll ever forget it. Melissa used to be a huge lover of outdoor activities and hiking, and since that experience, she refuses to go anywhere near the woods and only stays outside in places that are well lit and with a lot of people around. As far as she is concerned, she doesn't know what it was, but she never wants to see it again. The next story takes us to a man by the name of Gordon, who several summers back decided to go camping in the Grand Teton National Park. Like many of the other people in this video, he would pack up his truck, get all his gear, and drive from his home in Salt Lake City up to the park. And he found a very nice remote camping spot far away from all the regular campgrounds, where he would set up his tent and even made this really nice little fire pit. And the first night seemed normal enough. He cooked some food, enjoyed the quiet wilderness, and turned in for the night. And finally, at around 3 in the morning, he woke to a strange noise coming from the woods up behind his tent. And he described it like this deep, loud rumbling, kind of like a growl, but different. And so he lay there silently listening to try and discern what it was. But the noise would continue on and off for maybe 15 to 20 minutes, and it seemed to move around the area behind him. Now, as you can imagine, he was petrified. The only thing he could imagine making that sound was a bear, but he described that he had never heard of bears vocalizing quite like that. Now, eventually, the rumbling, as he described it, must have stopped, and he dozed back off from exhaustion. When he eventually woke up at sunrise, he would carefully peek out of his tent, but never saw anything unusual. Still, he decided to break camp and move to a more public campsite. Now, he didn't want to stick around and find out if that thing would come back again after dark, and so, really to this day, he has no idea what animal could have made that deep, creepy rumble. All he knows is that it scared him half to death and ruined his camping trip, because the next day he was so paranoid. But he does still love the outdoors and still does go out sometimes, but it's just he's a lot more cautious about the spots he chooses and doesn't really camp remotely anymore. I mean, can you blame him? This next story is actually sent in from a park ranger who had actually supposedly worked at Yellowstone and would describe themselves at the time of this writing being a 34-year-old ranger of sound mind and having no reason to embellish on what they have seen. And he would then go on to describe, he was anonymous by the way, that on one of his usual evening patrols along the Madison River on the western boundary of the park, it was roughly about 9:30 p.m. and dusk had just fallen. He would describe that visibility was still decent due to the full moon, and so he had decided to take a brief detour down an old fire access road that actually cuts towards the river through a lodgepole pine forest. Now, the road actually runs along the edge of a meadow where he has often spotted elk and moose at dusk. Now, as his truck approached the meadow, his headlights flashed across a figure standing just back from the tree line. And so he slams on his brakes in reaction as soon as his mind registered what he was seeing. And he would describe this massive upright canine of at least 10 feet tall, very shaggy looking. And it actually appeared to be pivoting from side to side, its torso kind of bent forward as if poised to charge. Though the lighting was poor, this guy could clearly make out powerful wolf-like hind legs accentuated by sharp talons. No obvious tail was visible. This thing's forelimbs seemed almost human-like in proportion compared to its hindquarters, and the head was obscured in shadow, and try as he might, he could not make out any distinctive facial features. And as any of us would think, he thought, what the hell kind of freakish bear is that? And then his police training had snapped him back to reality. This was no bear. And so he slowly draws his firearm and reverses the truck back up to the road, watching for any sudden movements. And this bizarre thing merely swayed in place, making no attempt to pursue him. Now, after putting some distance, he sped off to report the sighting, and now travels that road only in broad daylight, but he's never witnessed that creature again in over the 20 patrols of that area. And he does still wonder if this thing does roam around Yellowstone or whether other visitors could be at risk. He stresses that this was like no animal he's ever come across in his decade patrolling those woods, and it troubles him to think what it may be capable of if encountered at close range by guests or tourists who are unarmed. Story 13 brings us to a man of just last year in November of 2022 who had decided to take a camping trip up to Arcadia National Park. This individual described themselves as an avid hiker and outdoorsman, and very much so looked forward to a few days alone in nature. And so after parking at a remote trailhead, they would shoulder their pack and hiked several miles into the wild backcountry. And so when dusk finally fell on the first night, they set up their tent in a small clearing among the ponderosa pines, and as they gathered woods and started a modest campfire, they swore that they sensed something watching them from the woodline. But when they shone their flashlight toward the tree line, there was nothing out of the ordinary. And so they didn't think much of it. The night went by pretty normal, even though it was quieter than usual, and they turned in having no issues. Well, the next day, they set out to summit a nearby peak, and after a tough scramble up a scree slope, he reached the top and took in all the views of the forest around. Now, this trip alone took almost all day, and so as day was now turning back to night, he quickly realized I may have overestimated the time it took for this, and so he hurries back down to make it to camp before dark because he does not have a flashlight with him. Now, about halfway there, he hears this scream echoing from somewhere downslope, and he freezes in his tracks as his heart is now pounding. The wail that he had heard sounded almost human, but far too loud and guttural. And when it finally trailed off, the forest went really quiet, far more quiet than the night prior. And fortunately, he was able to make it back, so he gets back to his campsite, quickly reinforces his food bag hang, convinced something large was prowling nearby, and as you can imagine, he barely slept that night, jittery and hyper aware of every little sound near him. Now, at one point, he was certain that he had heard heavy footsteps circle his camp just out of sight, but when he sat up and shined his light toward the noise, like the first night, he saw nothing. Now, somehow he had managed to sleep, although not very much. He just decided to cut his trip short. He packed up his camp and then discovered a massive human-like track in the dirt nearby, far bigger than any human foot. But one thing he described that was strange is that it didn't have 5 toes, it only had 3. Now, immediately the hair on the back of his neck stood up, and he pictured some sort of hulking monster watching his camp. And that made him hustle down the trail even faster, constantly glancing back over his shoulder, expecting to see it there, but he never did. Now, he never slowed down until he reached his vehicle, incredibly grateful to leave behind the backcountry that he just came from. He still has no idea what made those screams or those heavy footsteps or what was stalking him, but after that trip, he is convinced there is something lurking there in Arcadia's forest that simply cannot be explained. Our very last story takes us into the wilds of the Grand Teton National Park by an individual who was unnamed who wanted to do some camping there. And so this person had drove up to Jackson, entered the park from the south entrance off of Highway 89, and after setting up their tent at the Jenny Lake campground, they headed out onto the trails north of the lake. Now, they would describe the afternoon sun being very bright as they hiked along the Cascade Canyon Trail up to Lake Solitude, and all seemed very quiet with just a few other hikers on the trail. And as they stopped to take a photo of the lake, they suddenly heard a strange coughing sound echoing off the canyon walls. It was this deep, guttural cough that went on and on and on, and far too loud and sustained to be a bear or mountain lion. Now, as you can imagine, they felt very puzzled about what can make such a strange noise. And so they brushed it off. They continued up along the trail up into North Fork Cascade Canyon. Now, at this point, the terrain was growing far steeper and the pine forest thicker, and so they scrambled up a talus slope to get a view down the canyon. As they peeked over the boulders, they spotted something moving through the trees down below, and describe it looking like a large wolf or a coyote, but it seemed to wobble awkwardly on all fours as it trotted uphill. Now, when it emerged from the pines into a clearing, the individual telling the story gasped and ducked down because this was no ordinary canine. It moved with a stooped posture, almost crouched, with powerful front limbs and a thin hindquarters. Its head was enormous, sitting directly onto its shoulders with tall pointed ears, and it was covered in sandy brown fur with a bushy tail held straight out. The creature apparently sniffed at the wind, then sat back on its haunches. Now, to this person's shock, it actually stretched its forelimbs out and scratched itself like a human. Now, as they shifted their position, their foot kicked a rock down the slope, and this thing immediately whipped around, its eyes glowing yellow, looking at this person's direction. And so this person claims that they stared at each other for a long moment before it then kind of bolted into the woods, covering ground rapidly on all fours. And you can imagine that they would beat a hasty retreat down the trail, terrified by this bizarre monster they had just witnessed. Though they are half convinced that it was just an odd-looking wolf, deep down, they can't help but sense that they had seen something unnatural, potentially supernatural on that very day. And if you guys have a story that you want shared, simply email me down below, stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. I'd be happy to get in touch. And because you've made it this far into the video, I want you to all to comment down below strange things in stranger places, so I know who made it to the end. And if you guys enjoyed today's episode, be sure to go ahead and smack that big old red like and subscribe button for more content just like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you in the very next episode.